Mr. Lally. Good morning.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name?
Kerry Roberts, Roberts.
And where do you live, ma'am?
Canton, Mass.
How long have you lived in Canton, Mass?
10 years.
And who, if anyone, do you live in Canton with?
My husband, my 2 children.
And your 2 children, how old are they? And boy, girl?
My son is 12, my daughter's 14.
And do you work, ma'am?
I do.
What do you do for work?
I'm an executive assistant.
How long have you been doing that?
17 years.
And your husband, Kurt, does he work as well?
Yes.
What does he do for work?
He's a heavy equipment operator.
And how long has he been doing that?
Maybe 20 plus years.
Now, if I could turn your attention to the evening of January 28th, 2022 into the morning of the 29th. Do you recall those dates?
Yes.
And do you recall what days of the week they were?
Say it again.
Do you recall what days of the week they were?
Friday.
So the 28th
Friday the 28th.
into a
Saturday the 29th.
Now, on the evening of the 28th, do you recall what you were doing that evening?
I was bowling with my daughter and her friends and one of the mothers.
And do you recall where that was?
Westgate Lanes in Brockton.
And about what time was it that you got home from that?
Probably about 8:30ish because there was a storm coming, so we wanted to be home. I didn't want to be out late.
And when you got home, you and your daughter, is that correct?
Say that one more time?
You and your daughter came home around 8:30 or so?
Yes.
Who, if anyone else from your house, was home when you got there?
I think my husband was home. He was going out. I think I passed him, and he was heading out to meet his friends. My son was not home.
And who were the friends that he was going out to meet?
John O'Keefe and Michael Camerano.
So, Ms. Roberts, I'd like to start with just Mr. Camerano. How do you know him?
He's been childhood friends with my husband.
And do you know where your husband was going to meet Mr. Camerano and Mr. O'Keefe?
Miss at McCarthy's. It's a bar in Canton.
Sort of in the center of town, is that right?
Yes.
And Mr. O'Keefe, how do you know him?
I've known him since high school.
And where did you go to high school?
Braintree High School.
And how is it that you came to know Mr. O'Keefe? How would you describe your relationship with Mr. O'Keefe?
He was one of my closest friends.
In addition to John O'Keefe, through growing up and going to Braintree High, were you familiar with any other members of the O'Keefe family?
Yes, Kristen, his sister, was a senior when I was a freshman. John was a year older than me, and Paul was 2 years younger than me. So at some point, I was in school with all of them.
And after high school, at some point, did you come to know any of the members of the O'Keefe family while you were living in Canton?
Yes, my son and John's nephew went to an in-home daycare together. So I went to go pick up my son at one point, and Kristen was there, and we kind of figured out that we lived in the same neighborhood that we were going to be moving into. And then Kristen got sick.
And during that time, sort of when you first reconnected with Kristen, about how old was your son and her son?
My son was 18 months. Patrick he's almost a year older.
And your son and Patrick Furbush, did they end up going to the same school in Canton?
Yes, they went to home daycare. They went to preschool, pre-K. And by the time they got to elementary school, they got separated because they were troublemakers.
But did they go to the same school all throughout?
Yes.
And what, if any, other activities did your son do along with Kristen's son, Patrick?
Well, Patrick wanted to try hockey. So they did hockey together, and then he didn't like that. And they played baseball together since they were T-ball, like 4 or 5.
Now, you mentioned that Kristen O'Keefe, or Kristen Furbush at that point, at some point after you met her, she got sick, is that right?
Correct.
Eventually she passed away, is that right?
Correct.
After she passed away, her husband also passed away?
Correct.
And at some point after that, what, if any, role did John O'Keefe have with reference to these?
Well, when Kristen passed away, I was in touch with John, just seeing if they needed help with the kids, getting them to and from wherever, because I was down the street. Kristen passed away, and then he said, I might move in. Steve's got to figure out finances, but I might move into your neighborhood. And I said, oh, okay. And then when Steve died, John did move in, and he took over raising the kids.
And fair to say that you were, with reference to your son being friends with his nephew Patrick, you would see him fairly often, and by him I mean John O'Keefe.
Oh, yes, daily. Mm-hmm.
And what, if any, at some point did John and his niece and nephew move from down the street from your house?
Yes, they moved across town. So I live on the Milton side. He moved over sort of near the Stoughton side.
About how far a drive is that sort of from your house to where you moved to? It was on Meadows, correct?
Yes, and it depends because Canton's terrible for traffic. Maybe 7 minutes, maybe 8, depending. And if it's in the evening, it's longer.
And after Mr. O'Keefe and his niece and his nephew moved sort of across town, where did his nephew Patrick, where did he go to school at?
He remained at the same school that he was at with my son. So on Wednesdays, when John couldn't grab him in time because he'd be working in the city, Patrick would come home with me.
You were familiar with what Mr. O'Keefe did for a living?
He was a Boston police officer, but at the time he was working in an office registering sex offenders.
And so you would help out as far as picking up his son. What, if any, assistance did you have with regard to his niece Kaylee as well?
Say that one more time.
What, if any, assistance did you have with regard to Mr. O'Keefe and his schedule with regard to his niece Kaylee as well?
I didn't take care of Kaylee as much. That was sort of, there was other women, Jen McCabe, one of them, she sort of really took hold of caring for Kaylee because her daughter was friends with Kaylee, and I sort of got Patrick. So
Miss Riley, you have to keep your voice up. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Sorry.
And if you could keep your voice up too, okay?
My apologies. And then through the years that you knew Mr. O'Keefe when he lived in Canton and your time being friends with him, what, if any, conversations would you have with Mr. O'Keefe in regard to any sort of relationships or dating or anything like that?
Well, he dated a lot of people. So it depends.
Your conversations with what, if any, sort of role would you have, or what, if any, knowledge did you have in reference to the people that he dated?
My husband, whenever he would go on a date with somebody, he would have my husband come meet them, sort of say, like, what do you think? And he had a couple of girlfriends that were very nice.
Now, at some point, did you become aware of a person by the name of Kerry?
Yes.
And when was it and how was it that you first came to know that person?
John called me and said, Karen and I are going to stop by because we had people over. And I said, who is Karen? Because I didn't know if he was going to bring someone from high school and surprise me with a random, I had never heard of her. And he said, you know who Karen is? The girl I'm dating. And I said, nope, but okay. And then they came over that night. And
do you recall when about that was?
I think it was sometime in July.
In July of what year?
What are we, 2020?
Sometime shortly after sort of the COVID pandemic?
Yes.
How would you describe your relationship, if any, with Karen?
She was like another person that took care of the kids. She took care of Kaylee and Patrick a lot, so I would coordinate with her if Ryan and Patrick were going to go to the golfing range, or if Ryan was going to go with them to the Red Sox game, that kind of thing. We weren't do lunch or hang out like girlfriends.
Was there any occasions where you had for socialization or go out as couples or anything like that with Mr. O'Keefe?
No, they came over our house one time, and then we'd do baseball tournaments down the Cape, and we'd all get together, but the four of us never went out.
And just for clarity purposes, do you see Ms. Reed in the courtroom today?
Yep. No.
Identify her as to where she's seated or an article of clothing she's wearing.
Say that again?
Could you identify as to where she's seated or an article of clothing that she's wearing?
She is seated at that front table, and she has a black and white suit jacket.
I just ask the record reflect identification sent by the witness.
Yes.
Okay. Now, coming back to that evening of the 28th, your husband went out to meet Mr. Camerano in this room, correct?
Yes.
And do you know about what time it was that your husband Kurt arrived home that night?
Maybe around 10:30.
And after he arrived home, what, if anything, specifically do you recall the two of you doing or anything before going off to bed?
I remember sitting on the couch, and the front door is right there, and it was open, and it started to snow. It had just started to come down probably about midnight, but it was coming down fast, so you knew it was. Little snowflakes usually mean a big snowstorm, and I said, well, it's starting, so we went to bed because we knew we weren't going out anywhere.
And as far as turning your attention to the next morning, at some point you awoke. Do you recall what it was that awoke you that morning on the 29th?
Karen called me at 5 o'clock in the morning.
And is that sort of a normal occurrence as far as Ms. Reed calling you and specifically calling you that early?
No.
And when you went to answer the phone, at some point did you look at sort of like the screen to your phone?
I don't know. I just answered
Ask this in a different way. As far as, at some point, did you realize or did you know whether or not that call that at some point you answered, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the call that you answered, do you know whether or not that was the first call that Ms. Reed had placed you that morning or no?
It was the second call, only from looking at my phone after, because I said, oh, shoot, she called me. She just called and I didn't. She called twice.
And the phone call that you answered, what time was that?
5 on the dot.
And if you know from looking at your phone, the phone call that you didn't wake up or didn't answer, do you know how long before that phone call was?
I think it was a minute or two before.
So 5 o'clock on the dot, you get a phone call, you answer it, and it's Ms. Reed, is that right?
Correct.
And that phone number, you had her sort of programmed into your phone as a contact, is that correct?
Yes.
And on prior occasions, had you called that number or gotten a call from that number on prior occasions?
Yes.
And when you got that call or made that call, who was the other person on the end that you received?
Say that again?
Maybe a pretty simple question as far as it goes, but just with reference to any prior phone calls that you either got or received with that number that you programmed in as Karen Reed. When you spoke to someone by calling or receiving a call from that contact, who was on the other end of the call?
Karen Reed.
Okay. So you answered the phone sometime right around 5 a.m. and can you describe to the jury sort of what the content of that conversation was?
I answered the phone and she said, John's dead. Kerry, Kerry, Kerry. And then she hung up.
And as far as her end of the conversation, did you say anything or get a chance to say anything before she hung up?
No. And
when she's speaking to you and saying those words to you over the phone, how loudly is she saying those words?
Very loud. She woke my husband, who was sleeping.
So at the time that the phone rings and you pick it up, your husband's sleeping, correct?
Yes.
And then afterwards, he's awake?
Correct.
Now, what happened then?
Then I got out of bed and Kurt said, what was that? I said, I don't know. Something's happening. And I think I started getting dressed at that point because I don't know if I started getting dressed at that point or after she called back again. I tried to call her, I think a couple times back to be like, what is going on? Finally, she called me back again and she said, I'm afraid John might be dead. He might have gotten hit by a plow. He did not come home last night. I was not supposed to stay in Canton last night, and he would never leave Kaylee alone. I think something happened.
And do you recall earlier in the day of the 28th having any communication with either Mr. O'Keefe or Ms. Reed?
I did with John. He texted me.
Do you recall generally what that was about?
My son got into a scuffle with some boy at school, and Patrick wasn't in school at the time. I think he went to a doctor's appointment, but Patrick got wind of it. So John was calling to see if my son was okay.
Now, turning back to, again, that morning on the 29th, you called Ms. Reed a couple times. She didn't answer. Is that correct?
Correct.
And at some point, she called you back?
Correct.
And about how long was it after that initial phone call that you had where she hung up? How much time it elapsed between that call and the next one?
I don't know, maybe 5 minutes.
And so when she calls back, she makes those statements to you that you just testified about. And upon her making those statements, what, if anything, was your response?
I said, then she said she checked Kaylee's phone to see if John had called. And I said, okay, where are you now? And she said, I'm driving. Can I come to your house? Will you drive my car? I don't remember anything from last night. We drank so much, I don't remember anything. And I said, you need to go home and be with Kaylee if she's there by herself. I'll go look for him or something of that nature. Because I said, you're going to get a DUI. If you were drinking all night last night and you don't remember anything, you shouldn't be driving.
All right, so next question, please.
When you were talking to her on the phone, what, if any, observations did you make of sort of how she was speaking
She was very frantic, and her voice was elevated. She was very frantic.
and the loudness that you were describing during the course of that first phone call? What, if any, observations did you make with respect to that in regard to the second?
Same. Throughout the rest of the day, it was the same.
So you indicate to her that she needs to go home, is that right?
Correct.
And what, if anything, did she say in response to that?
She said, I'm going to come to your house. Will you drive my car? And I said, okay.
And after that, what did you do from there?
I started getting dressed. I think that's when I was starting getting dressed. And my husband said, where are you going? I said, I don't know. Something happened. John didn't come home. Karen's worried, so I'm going to go help her. And he said, you're not going anywhere. It's a blizzard. And I said, yes, I am. And I went downstairs. I started the car, cleared it off, and I sat there waiting, and she didn't come. So I called.
During the time that you're waiting in the car, do you know about how long period it was that you were waiting in the car?
I would say at least 10 minutes of sitting in the car.
And to that point, as far as when you went outside to the car, what, if anything, did you observe about the weather, and what, if anything, did you do with your car as you were turning it on?
I cleaned the car off. I turned the car on. I got in it, and I thought to myself, well, she thinks he might have got hit by a plow or something. I'll see if there's any accidents. So I called the Canton non-emergency line, and I said, have there been any plow accidents? My friend's boyfriend didn't come home. And they said no, there were no accidents. So then I called Good Samaritan Hospital and Milton to see if anybody had been brought in a car accident. They said no. And then finally Karen called back.
Before we get to that, just in reference to, at any point in time, did you call Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
And when you called Mr. O'Keefe, were you able to speak to Mr. O'Keefe?
No.
Do you know how many times you called Mr. O'Keefe?
My husband called him, and I think I called him.
And when was that in relation to you going out to your car and clearing it?
That was when I was in the house. Karen actually said, can you try and call him?
And you did, and you didn't get an answer?
Correct.
And do you know whether or not your husband got an answer?
He did not.
So you go out to the car, you're waiting, and you make those phone call initially to Canton Police, is that correct?
Yes.
And do you know who you spoke to at Canton Police?
I believe it was Officer Good.
Is that someone that you knew in any way prior to this date of January 29th?
We have mutual friends, but no, I'd never met him.
Now, you call the hospitals, and then at some point after you finish speaking to the hospitals, the defendant then calls you back, correct?
Yes.
And what, if anything, can you describe to the jury sort of what was the content of that conversation that third time?
She said, I said, where are you? I'm in the car. And she said, I'm at Jen's house. And I said, Jen who? She said, Jen McCabe. She's going to drive my car. And I said, okay, stay there. I'll come to there. We'll follow and we'll drop your car off. We'll just take my car and go look for him. And I drove to Jen's and I pulled in the driveway behind them. I was still on speakerphone. Jen is driving. Karen's in the passenger seat, and we drove. I said, do you remember, did you look through the house? Could he be passed out somewhere in the house? She said, I don't know. I didn't look. So I said, let's do that. Let's get in the cars. We're not taking 2 cars. It's a blizzard. We're going to go back to Meadows, and we're going to go look in the house first. He could be passed out behind the couch or on the floor, or who knows. So we went to the house.
Yeah, I'm sorry, before you get into that, just as far as directionality and where you're going at this initial stage, you're sort of directing what's going to happen and where you're going to go, correct?
Correct.
Now, you had mentioned that the defendant said she was at Jen's house. You asked Jen who, and she said Jennifer McCabe, correct?
Objection.
I'll allow it.
With regard to Ms. McCabe, did you know her, or how did you know her prior to this morning of January 29th?
I had met her once when John took her and I to Reebok because he's got a 50% discount, so we would go periodically and get the kids' shoes. So she, John, and myself went to Reebok, got shoes, and then we went to the hillside for lunch. That was it. I wasn't friends with her.
Is that someone that you had programmed in your phone as a contact? Did you have her information prior to January 29th?
No.
And when you went to Ms. McCabe's house that morning, how was it that you knew where Ms. McCabe's house was at that time?
I've picked up Kaylee there a time or two for John and brought her home if I was heading that way, because Jen's house is on the way to John's.
And so you go to Ms. McCabe's house, and can you describe for the jury sort of what you observe or what you see when you're first coming up to Ms. McCabe?
I pulled in the driveway behind Karen's car, and Karen and Jen are in the car talking. I'm still on Bluetooth, so I can hear them. And Karen said that she remembered leaving him at Waterfall. And Jen said, no, I saw you pull up to my sister's house. And then at some point in the conversation, she said, what about my taillight? What about my taillight? And I looked, and there was a piece missing, but it was caked on with snow. You could tell there was a little black hole, but there was snow like caked on it, and it was a blizzard at this point.
Now, just as far as over the course of this early morning when you're making that drive from your house to Ms. McCabe's house, correct?
Yes.
So during that time, can you describe sort of what the lighting conditions were, what the roadway conditions were, what you observed as you were driving over there?
It was not light out yet, and it was really bad driving.
And bad driving in reference to snow, is that correct?
Yes.
So you get to Ms. McCabe's house, and during the drive from your house to Ms. McCabe's house, you're speaking to both Ms. McCabe and Ms. Reed?
Yes.
And with reference, I think you've said a couple times as far as a Bluetooth. So as far as what you're hearing on the other side of the conversation, is it just one person, or are you able to hear sort of everything that's going on in the car?
I could hear everything. It was like a regular phone call in the car.
From where you were, your impression was it was hooked up to the speaker of the car.
Correct.
And when you get to Ms. McCabe's house, or what you were just testifying about as far as the taillight, when is it that you're making those observations?
In Jen's driveway.
And so about how far away from the defendant's car are you the first time that you see or your attention is drawn to this taillight?
I was parked right behind them in the driveway.
And can you describe which part of the vehicle you were looking at as far as which taillight that you're observing this damage?
The right passenger.
And so from there, as far as Ms. McCabe's driveway, you make these observations. Where is it that you go from there?
Say it again?
Sure. So after you're making those observations and you're overhearing that conversation, or you're having that conversation over Bluetooth, where did the three of you go?
We went to Meadows, to John's house.
And how was it that each of you sort of got from Ms. McCabe's house to John's house on Meadows?
Jen drove Karen's car, and I followed behind in my car.
And when you arrived there, where did you go? Where did you park? Like,
I pulled in, I think I pulled in right behind. She pulled her car sort of in front of the garage bays, and I pulled in the driveway behind her.
and when you say she, do you know who was driving?
Jen McCabe, sorry.
Driving and Miss Reed's in the front passenger seat.
Correct.
And you're driving your car behind.
Correct.
But what kind of car did you have?
A Ford Explorer,
Do you recall what color it was?
dark gray.
And as far as Miss Reed, do you recall what kind of vehicle she had at that point?
A Lexus SUV,
Recall what color that was?
black.
Now, with respect to Mr. O'Keefe, do you recall what kind of vehicle John O'Keefe had?
He has a Traverse.
And do you recall what color that was?
It's like a beige green.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, if I could ask to publish what's been marked as exhibit number 2.
Okay.
Ms. Roberts, directing your attention to the screen over here, do you recognize what is up on the screen?
That's John's house.
And does that seem like a fair and accurate portrayal of what John's house looked like at around the time of January 29th when you went over that morning?
Much snowier, but yes.
Sorry.
Oh, I said it was much more snow, but yes.
Now, not visible in this particular photograph or the driveway that you were talking about, facing Mr. O'Keefe's house at Meadows Ave, as we are in this picture, whereabouts would the driveway be? To the left or the right or something?
To the right.
And, Your Honor, with court's permission, if I could ask to publish what's been marked as exhibit 91.
Okay.
And again, Ms. Roberts, do you recognize what's up on the screen?
That is John's car.
And what is it that's behind John's car?
Behind a basketball hoop?
No, I'm sorry. That's correct. Not the rear of the vehicle, but sort of in the photograph behind on the other side of the passenger side of the vehicle.
Oh, the garage doors?
And there are 2 garage doors, one on the left, one on the right. Is that correct? You're familiar with this house? You've been over it a number of times when Mr. O'Keefe lived there.
Correct.
And as far as what, if anything, were you familiar with as far as Mr. O'Keefe having regarding sort of security around his house?
Security, he has a Ring camera that was in the driveway and a Ring camera that was at the side door.
And with regard to the garage itself, as far as you've been in there as well?
Yes.
And so what is behind the left door of the garage?
His big old blue convertible.
And on the right side of the garage, what, if anything, is in behind it?
Nothing. He's got all organized stuff and kids sporting. I don't know if he parked in there or not.
Now, as far as how Mr. O'Keefe kept his garage, kept his home, was there a particular way in which he kept it when he lived there, you know?
Neat freak.
I'm sorry, what was that?
He was a neat freak.
Okay.
And as you enter into this garage, what, if any, access would you then have to inside the home?
There's a set of stairs and it brings you right into like the mudroom, which leads into the kitchen.
Now, when you would go over to Mr. O'Keefe's house on this occasion or any other occasion, any rules or preferences would Mr. O'Keefe have with regard to footwear?
You did not wear footwear in the house. You took your shoes off.
And is that something that applied to people who lived there as well as people who were visiting?
Yes.
And how would you describe as that a relatively strict rule?
Yes.
Now, Your Honor, with the court's permission, if I could, I'd like to publish a portion of Exhibit 6, ring video.
Okay.
Gentlemen, if I could have from the driveway video number 154. I'd ask you to just pause that, please. So, Ms. Roberts, do you recognize what's up on the screen?
Yes, that's Karen's car and my car. And John's is in the background.
Now, in front of you on the desk, there should be a laser point. It's not, just Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
So pressing on that button and pointing sort of at the screen, if I could ask you just direct the jury's attention to where you see Ms. Reed's vehicle, where you see your vehicle, and where you see Mr. O'Keefe's vehicle with it all.
That is John's car. That is Karen's car. That is my car.
Is this a fair and accurate portrayal of sort of where the cars were and what things looked like when you first arrived at Mr. O'Keefe's house, coming from Ms. McCabe's house?
Yes.
Ms. Gilman, if you could. Positive. Now, with reference to any individuals that you observed in this video, again, using the laser pointer, if you could draw the jury's attention to who you observed and where they were.
That is Jen McCabe, and that is Karen Reed, and that's me.
And at some point, you enter in through the garage, is that right?
Correct.
Now, as far as the garage doors were concerned, when you came back that morning, what, if anything, did you notice about the garage door?
The right garage door wouldn't close.
So it was open when you arrived?
I don't recall if it was open when we arrived, but when we were leaving, it wouldn't close.
And do you recall, do you have any idea of sort of how that mechanically worked, like how you would open, how you would close the garage door?
There's a code on the side.
And at any point in time, whenever you noticed that the garage door was open, were you or any of the people that you were able to close that door?
No.
And so was that the door that you entered into in order to get into the garage, to get into the mudroom, take off your shoes and whatnot?
Correct.
And when you came into the house that morning, and you entered into the mudroom, what, if anything, did you do with your shoes, and what, if anything, did you observe Ms. McCabe and the defendant do with their shoes?
Jen and I both had taken our shoes off in the sort of steps in the garage before we entered into the mudroom. We took our shoes off, and Karen just walked in.
And Ms. Gilman, if you could just play the video. Now, Ms. Roberts, with reference to the Ring video security system that Mr. O'Keefe had at his home, if you know, do you know who had access to that?
I do not.
You obviously, do you know whether or not Mr. O'Keefe had access to that?
He did, yes.
Okay. Do you know how or what device he used in order to access it?
I only know he had it on his phone
How do you know he had it on his phone?
because he would check it all the time to see if the kids were home or dropped off or.
That's something you did in your presence?
Yes.
Now, with regard to, at some point when you get to the home, beyond the sort of initial observations you made in Ms. McCabe's driveway with regard to the right rear passenger taillight of Ms. Reed's vehicle, what, if any, other observations did you make, or what, if anything else, did you do with reference to that area of the vehicle?
Karen did point it out at one point in the driveway. She said, my taillight, look at my taillight. And I looked at it and I said, you told me you don't remember anything from last night. She said, do you think I hit him? Do you think I hit him? And I said, no, I don't think you hit him. I think you probably hit something, but let's just go in the house and look for him.
And so as far as your recollection is concerned, that sort of interaction that you had or looking at the taillight, when did that happen?
I don't know if it was when, well, it obviously wasn't when we got there. It was what must have been when we were leaving to go out to look for him.
When you what? I'm sorry.
I wasn't sure if it was when we arrived or when we were leaving to go back out and look for him, but now that I've seen the video, it's obviously when we came back out of the house.
Okay.
And who was present for that?
Who was present?
Yes.
Jen McCabe, Karen Reed, and myself.
And as far as where Ms. McCabe parked that vehicle, at any point in time that you were at the house, did that vehicle move at all? And by that vehicle, I mean Ms. Reed's vehicle.
I don't think so.
So where it's parked in that video is essentially where it stayed as far as you know.
I believe so.
Now, with reference to those observations or when you were looking at the rear passenger taillight area of Ms. Reed's vehicle, how close to the vehicle were you when you were making those observations?
Right in front of it. There was one piece, like a rectangle encapsulated, like whatever was broken. I remember there was one piece of metal sort of sticking out. So if it was an encasement for a light of some sort, I remember looking at it and the piece was sort of sticking out and I thought someone's going to catch their sleeve on that or something.
And now from there, when you arrive at the house, you go into the house to take off your shoes. What happened then?
I started looking, Jen started looking, Karen, her and Jen went upstairs. I started looking downstairs. I started looking on the other side of the couches to see if maybe he passed out somewhere. And then I went upstairs and Karen was standing in John's room. The bed was made. She was just standing there. Jen had gone in to talk to Kaylee. And then I said, all right, let's go.
Now,
He's not in the house. He's not in the house.
As far as your knowledge of Mr. O'Keefe, him not coming home when any of the children were home, was that something that was normal?
Him not coming home if the children were home?
Right.
Yeah, he would not do that.
And obviously you knew Kaylee was there, but what, if anything, did you know as to where Patrick was at that?
He was at a friend's house.
And was that something that you knew independent of this morning or what had transpired up to that point?
Say that again?
How did you find out that Patrick was at a friend's house? So you know?
Karen said, I said, where's Patrick? She said he's at his friend's.
So you were in the downstairs area of the home, is that correct?
Yes.
And looking through the rooms, you didn't find Mr. O'Keefe, correct?
No.
Now, at any point in time, did you go upstairs?
I did.
And when you went upstairs, where in the upstairs did you go?
At the top of the stairs is John's bedroom, so I looked in there. I looked in the bathroom. I looked in the closet. I looked in Patrick's room. I looked in the other two bedrooms, and Kaylee was in her room. So Jen was in there, but I was just looking through the house.
And as far as Mr. O'Keefe's bedroom, when you looked in there, what, if anything, did you observe as far as the condition of the bed?
The bed was made.
You mentioned you looked in a variety of different rooms on the second floor. You said sort of two other rooms. What, if anything, were those other rooms used for, if you know?
I think one of them was a computer room. It was the room that faced the front of the house, and the back room had a bed in it that Mrs. O'Keefe would stay in when she would stay over.
And again, just to be clear, when you say Mrs. O'Keefe, you mean John's mother?
John's mother, sorry.
And as far as the computer room, who, if anyone, had access to that, if you know?
Had access to the computer room?
Yes. What was it used for? Space?
Oh, there was a desk with a computer or laptop.
Did you know whose laptop that was, whether it was John's, whether it was the defendant's, whether it was the kids?
I don't know if it was the defendant's at the time, but John's laptop used to be in that room.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd ask if I could publish just a couple more photos on the screen for Ms. Roberts.
Okay.
Ms. Gilman, if I could start with Exhibit 92. Ms. Roberts, directing your attention up to the screen, do you recognize what's depicted in that photograph?
That's Karen Reed's Lexus.
And specifically, if you could, using the laser pointer in front of you, direct the jury's attention to where you observed damage that one.
That's where that That's where the metal piece I was describing was.
As far as what's depicted in this photograph up on the screen, is that consistent with what you observed in Mr. O'Keefe's driveway and Mr. McCabe's driveway when you saw it that way?
Well, caked in snow, but yes.
So absent of snow, yes.
Yes.
And Ms. Gilman, if I could have the next exhibit number 9. Again, Ms. Roberts, do you recognize what's depicted in this photograph?
Yes.
Essentially a closer-up image of the same area, correct?
Yes.
And what's depicted in this closer-up image, is that also consistent with what you observed in Mr. McCabe's driveway and Mr. O'Keefe's driveway that way?
Yes.
Now, Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask again if I could publish a portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 41.
Okay.
And Ms. Gilman, if I could ask you to fast forward to about 2 hours, 9 minutes, and 30 seconds. Play from there. Going to keep the pause there. Ms. Roberts, direct your attention up to the screen. You recognize what's on the pause portion of the screen from this video.
That's John's house.
And Ms. Gilman, if you could press play again. Ms. Gilman, if you could pause. And again, Ms. Roberts, directing your attention up to the screen, you recognize what's sort of in front of the camera in this particular portion of the video.
That's Karen's car and John's car.
And where you observe Karen's car and John's car, again, if you could just, using the laser pointer, direct your attention to where you observe each of those in this still frame here.
That's Karen's car. That's John's car.
And are those essentially the same positions that you were talking about that the jury saw earlier in the ring video from Mr. O'Keefe's house?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes. Do you want this up on the screen or down?
Up for now.
Okay.
But just a moment. Ms. Roberts, I'm going to show you just 2 photographs. Ask you to just look at those and finish.
Okay.
And do you recognize those? Or do you recognize what's depicted in them?
Do I recognize what?
What's depicted in each of those photographs?
Karen's car.
Okay. And may I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'll seek to introduce and admit as the next exhibits.
Okay, is there any objection?
No objection.
All right, thank you.
Your Honor, while those are being marked, may we approach?
Hold on. Sidebar.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask to publish first what's been marked as Exhibit 101.
Okay.
And Ms. Roberts, what's up on the screen now is Exhibit 101. You indicated that's Ms. Reed's vehicle in the same position where Ms. McCabe left the park on the property, correct?
Yes.
This is appear to be a still shot from the same video that you just saw in the prior.
Yes.
Ms. Gilman, if I could have Exhibit 102 now. And Ms. Roberts, what's up on the screen, that's the second photograph that I showed you just a moment ago.
Yes.
That's essentially a closer up or zoomed in image of what's in the same still image that you saw in the prior, correct?
Yes.
And again, if you could, using the laser pointer, just direct the jury's attention to the damage that you observed on the right rear passenger tail light of Ms. Reed's vehicle that morning. Okay. So, you can take that. Now you go, look through the home, you don't find Mr. O'Keefe, and what happens then?
Then I said, let's go look for him. If he might be walking home, or if you thought he got hit by a plow, let's just, and Jen and Karen wanted to go back to 34 Fairview where they were at. Jen said she saw her pull up to 34 Fairview the night before. So Karen really wanted to go back there. I was the one that said, no, let's drop a car off, go to Meadows and look through the house, and then we'll start looking if he's not in the house. So that's what we did. We got in the car and we were going to head back to Jen's sister's house.
And so this conversation, as far as the defendant, as you're testifying, really wanting to go to Fairview, when did that occur in relation to when you got to Mr. O'Keefe's?
On the way from Jen McCabe's house to John's house in the car.
So this is over the Bluetooth as you're driving?
Yes, Karen said I left him at Waterfall, and Jen said, no, I saw you pull up in front of my sister's.
And so after coming out of Mr. O'Keefe's house, do you exit the same way that you entered?
Yes.
Come out the garage door, get into your car?
Yes.
And if you could describe to the jury sort of where was everybody seated in your car when you did it?
I was driving, Karen was in the back seat, and Jen was in the passenger seat.
And as far as Ms. McCabe's sister's house, at the time, did you know where that was or who her sister was or anything like that?
I didn't even know she had a sister.
And you know about how long a drive or how far a drive or what the route was that you took going from Meadows to her sister's house?
I think we went main roads because we were looking to see, I mean, I don't know what we were looking for, but we were looking for him. I don't know if we thought he was walking home or if he got hit by a plow. So we went main roads. We pulled out, I think we went Bolivar Street, and then Jen was giving directions because I didn't know where we were going.
And to be clear, Bolivar Street, you're talking about, that's Bolivar?
Yes.
And so then Ms. McCabe is then giving you directions as you're driving, correct?
Correct.
Now, as you're driving, again, as far as what, if anything, did you see as far as plows or how were the roads treated at that time? What, if anything, did you observe in reference to that?
It was bad driving. There were plows out, but it was really bad driving.
And the visibility as you were driving from Mr. O'Keefe's house to Ms. McCabe's sister's house, how would you describe the visibility?
It was very poor. It was in the middle of a blizzard.
Now, when you get to the street, at some point you're directed by Ms. McCabe to Fairview Road, correct?
Correct.
And when you get to Fairview Road, do you recall whether or not you took a left or a right, or how did you come on to Fairview Road?
Off of Chapman Street, I took a right onto Fairview.
You took a right from Chapman onto Fairview?
Correct.
And as you're coming down Fairview Road, what, if anything, did you note or observe as far as the sort of elevation of the roadway?
You go downhill.
You go down a hill?
Yes.
This particular area of Canton, obviously you've lived in Canton for several years. Are you somewhat familiar with this area of Canton?
Yeah.
And how is it that you were familiar with the area of Canton prior to this date if you've never been to Ms. McCabe's house?
The commuter rail is right near there that I would take to work.
Are there any schools in that area as well?
Yes, the John F. Kennedy School.
And you mentioned that your son played baseball, correct?
Yes, and
Ball field.
my son and John's nephew also went to the home daycare across the street from the JFK.
Now, Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask to just publish a brief portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 12.
Okay.
Gentlemen, what I'm going to ask is if you could push this video forward to 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I'm sorry, if you could play it from there. I could ask him to stop right there. Mr. Roberts, from what you've seen on the video, as far as what's depicted in this video, is that a fair and accurate portrayal or consistent with what you observed that morning as you were driving around going from Mr. O'Keefe's house to Ms. McKay's sister's house?
Yes.
And the turn that this vehicle is taking at this point in the video, about 2 minutes and 40 seconds in, you recognize what street that vehicle is turning onto?
I believe it's Fairview.
And Ms. Gilman, if you could. Ms. Roberts, as you're driving from Mr. O'Keefe's house to this address on Fairview Road that you've never been to before, what's going on inside the car?
Karen was frantic. She wouldn't put her seatbelt on, and I was getting nervous because we're driving in a blizzard. She kept leaning in between the two seats. I think at some point she was texting in the back seat, and then she'd be leaning. She was just frantic the whole morning.
And as far as her screaming, do you recall anything specifically that she was screaming, or what, if any, sort of conversation was going on in the car as you were driving?
There was some conversation about a woman I didn't know that was Bella's mom. And she said, Bella's mom never liked me. I think Bella lived near Jen's sister, maybe. I don't know. Some conversation about Bella's mom, and Karen said she didn't like me.
And do you recall where you were in your travels when that topic of conversation came up?
No, I don't recall.
Now, in reference to following that, what, if anything, did you say in regards to any other sort of women?
Any other what?
Following that conversation in regard to Bella's mom, who you didn't know, what, if anything, did you say or introduce into the conversation?
Fairview Road runs along Spring Street, I think it is. Spring Lane. So Spring Lane and Fairview are both off at Chapman Street, and there was a woman he dated that lived on Spring Lane. So when Jen was telling me where her sister's house was, I said, I don't know where Fairview is. And she said, it's near Spring Lane. And I said, oh, where the dance instructor lived. John had once dated a dance instructor. And then Karen said, do you think he could have gone there? Do you think that's where he could have been? No, I was just using it as a reference point. She said it's near Spring Lane, and I knew that the dance instructor lived on Spring Lane.
And just to be clear, when you say the dance instructor, this would be for his niece, Kaylee?
Correct.
And you indicated that the two of them, being Mr. O'Keefe and the dance instructor, had dated at some point in the past, correct?
Yes.
How long ago was that?
Oh, it was when Kaylee was little. She was probably like 5.
So almost 10 years before this date that you're driving away. Now, as you're driving along and driving down Fairview, what is it that you're doing? What, if anything, do you observe Mr. McCabe doing? And then what, if anything, do you observe the defendant?
Well, we were looking for John walking or wherever he may be. So I'm driving and looking on both sides, and I think Jen was looking on both sides. And Karen she would be in the back seat, then she'd be in between us, then she'd be in the back seat, and then in between us.
And as you came down the hill on Fairview, what, if anything, what happened then?
Jen said, my sister's house is right up here. And all of a sudden, Karen said, there he is, there he is. Let me the F out of this car. And she started kicking the door
And how was she kicking the door?
with her feet. Well, how was she kicking the door?
How hard was she kicking?
Pretty hard. I mean, she wanted to get out of the car, but it was locked because once you start driving, the back doors lock. So I looked over and I didn't see anything. And I looked at Jen and I said, she's crazy. And I unlocked the door and I sat back and watched. And she ran over to a mound of snow.
And so as the time you're driving down the road, had you seen anything, as you're driving down, sort of looking at the side of the road, had you seen anything on your side of the vehicle?
No.
And when you say she gets out of the vehicle, is it your side or passenger side where Ms. McCabe is? That
The driver's side.
so she gets out of the driver's side of the vehicle and the back passenger, correct?
Correct.
And how quickly does she go sort of from your car to where she ends up?
She ran over to the mound.
And at that point in time, even when she runs over, could you see what she was running over to?
At some point, I realized it was the shape of a body.
And when was that you realized? When in this sort of sequence were you able to realize that?
That was in seconds. Once she ran over to his body, I said, oh my God. And she lifted up his shirt and started to lay on him.
And when you stopped to let her out, where were you in relation to that mound of snow or what you learned?
Well, I think my car was like in the middle of the road. I just stopped.
And in relation to where the mound of snow was, had you driven past it at that point? So where was it?
Yes.
So it was located behind your vehicle?
Yeah.
Ms. Gilman, if you could, I would ask us to plan on that for about 6 minutes and 30 seconds. Okay. What's depicted in the screen in front of this camera angle? Do you recognize what that is?
That's my car.
Is that essentially where you parked your car when Ms. Reed started kicking the doors and got out and ran over?
Yes.
Could you just press play for a moment? Pause it. Now, from this video, do you see where in relation to your vehicle, Mr. O'Keefe, where you found Mr. O'Keefe?
With the pointer?
Thank you. Ms. Gilman, if you could, again, display for about this.
Do you have a problem? You can run? Huh?
closet there. Individuals on screen again, but just using the laser pointer and directing their attention to those arms.
That is Jen McCabe. That's Karen Reed. That's me.
Just kind of play again. Take that down. Roberts, in relation to what you just saw in the video, as far as at some point the rear sort of tailgate or hatchback on your SUV, that was in the up position, is that correct?
Yes,
And do you recall why that was?
because I was having Jen get the baby blankets to wrap around him out of my car.
And is that something that you just sort of have in the back of your car at all times?
Yeah.
Now, at any point in time in that sequence, did you call anybody or have any sort of phone calls that you made that went to voicemail at that time?
Did I?
Yes.
I don't know.
And so nothing that you recall, is that correct?
Correct.
And did you observe Ms. McCabe make any phone calls that just sort of went to voicemail and she left her phone in your car?
Objection.
Sustained.
Let me take you back, sort of when you're pulling. So as far as the conditions when you pull up and the defendant's banging on the door and gets out and runs over to Mr. O'Keefe. What's depicted in that video, obviously without your vehicle being in the middle of the roadway, is that fair and accurate portrayal of what the road looked like and sort of what you saw upon your arrival?
Yes.
So after the defendant gets out of the vehicle, what did you do? Where did you go?
When I realized it was him or someone, I ran over and I dug his head out of the snow.
And to recall, you recognized the person in the snow as Mr. O'Keefe.
Once I dug his head out, yes.
And you recall how his body was positioned as far as how was he on his stomach, on his back, on his side?
He was on his back.
And so you brushed some snow away from his head, is that correct?
Off his face.
And when you were brushing the snow off his face, what, if anything, did you observe about his face or the condition of him?
He had blood coming out of his nose and his mouth. And his right eye it looked like a golf ball. His left eye was fine. The right eye looked like a golf ball.
Now, you mentioned that you wiped some snow from around his head. What, if anything else, did you observe on the rest of his body?
He was bleeding in the back of the head. So when I was wrapping I don't know why I was wrapping blankets around his head, but I didn't know. He had a cut on the back of his head.
Do you recall which side of his head that cut was on?
I don't. It just was blood on the blanket that was under his head.
Now, as far as the rest of his body, did that have snow on it as well?
Say it again, I'm sorry?
The rest of his body, separate from his head area, what, if any, snow did you observe on the rest of his body?
He was completely covered.
And you know about how much snow was covering the rest of his body?
I would say like 4 inches, maybe 3. I don't really remember exactly how many, but he was covered.
And so with reference to Mr. O'Keefe and when you arrived there, 3 of you being you, the defendant, and Ms. McCabe, what is it that you were doing when you first sort of come over to Mr. O'Keefe?
Well, Karen was laying on top of him, and I told her to get off him because I was going to do CPR. And I said, Jen, you need to call 911. And I started CPR. on his chest compressions, and then Karen was giving him mouth to mouth.
And as far as CPR goes, is that something that you had any training in prior to this?
Yes.
And can you tell the jury a little bit about that as far as what, if any, training did you have as far as CPR was concerned?
I get CPR certified every 2 years through the American Red Cross at work.
So you start doing chest compressions, is that right?
Correct.
And you direct Ms. McCabe to call 911?
Yes.
And what was the defendant doing at that?
She was doing mouth to mouth, and she was frantic again, running around. And
as she was running around, what, if anything else, was she doing or saying while she was running around?
Did I hit him? Did I hit him? Is he dead? Is he dead?
Is that something that she said once or more than once?
More than once.
And similar to sort of the tonality or the volume of the voice that you were describing before, was that consistent when you're there sort of in front of the house?
Yes.
Now, in relation to where you were with Mr. O'Keefe, obviously you've never been in this house before, is that right?
Correct.
What, if anything, did you observe as far as overhead lights or street lights or anything like that around that area where you found Mr. O'Keefe?
There was a fire hydrant, and there was some weird, like, electrical box thing sticking out of the ground.
But you don't recall any sort of like overhead lights or anything like that?
I don't recall.
Now, this process of you sort of doing compressions and Ms. Reed is doing mouth to mouth and then running around, is the mouth to mouth that she's doing, is that sort of consistent, or is it intermittent between? When is the running around in relation to the mouth to mouth?
I don't remember which was first. Or I was concentrating on doing chest compressions.
And so while you're doing the chest compressions, at some point first responders start to arrive?
Correct.
And about how long was it from the time that you sort of get out of the vehicle, go over, realize it's Mr. O'Keefe, et cetera, and to when the first responders arrive?
I don't know. Wasn't long. Maybe under 10 minutes.
During that time, or during any amount of time that you were there, did you see anybody from any of the houses on the street come out of the house, or any neighbors come out or anything like that?
No.
Once, if you recall, do you recall whether it was police or fire or ambulance or who showed up first?
I don't know. I think the police showed up first, or the EMTs. I just know the EMTs came over and said, we'll take it from here. I wasn't paying attention to what else was going on.
So you're sort of focused on the chest compressions, and at some point, some paramedic comes over and tells you they've got this.
Yes.
And so after that, where did you go?
After that, where did I go? I stayed in the area. I think I went back over to the car.
And as paramedics are working on John, you're over by your vehicle, correct?
I think so.
And so where was, what were you doing, and where was Ms. McCabe, and where was the defendant at that time?
Karen was running around the body while the EMTs were trying to work on him. She was just frantic.
And so you're over by the car, and Ms. Reed is running around over where Mr. O'Keefe is.
Yes.
Where was Ms. McCabe?
I don't know. She was somewhere around the car.
So closer to you than to where Mr. O'Keefe was?
I don't know.
Now, where Mr. O'Keefe was, if you know, where was he in relation to the roadway or the paved sort of pathway of Fairview Road?
I don't know, because you couldn't tell which was the road and which was the grass. Like, you couldn't tell where the road began and ended. So I don't know.
Now, you described the defendant sort of running around Mr. O'Keefe frantically. What, if anything, was she saying at that point?
Is he dead? Is he dead? Is he dead?
And that sort of phraseology, or the way she put that, was that consistent throughout? Is that how she stated it?
Yes.
And again, in that same sort of loud volume voice at the time?
Yes.
Now, at some point, Mr. O'Keefe is taken from where he is by the paramedics to an ambulance, correct?
Yes.
And as he's being taken off the ground, what, if anything, did you observe in that area?
His phone was under him, and it was grass.
Now, as far as the grass that you observed, how was that in relation to sort of the rest of the area where Mr. O'Keefe was?
Everything else had snow.
So everything else is covered in snow, and when he's lifted off the ground underneath his body, is that where the grass is?
Yes.
And his phone was where in relation to his body? As far as when he's lifted up, what part of his body had been open?
Like maybe his shoulder, maybe it was like his back. So when they lifted him up, it was under where like his, whatever that, the right side of his back.
And what I'm asking is basically sort of up towards the shoulder blade or down towards his lower back, if you
In the middle.
know. And when you saw the phone on the grass, what, if anything, did you do with Mr. O'Keefe's phone?
I picked it up. I put it in my pocket. And at some point, one of the first responders asked if I had it. I handed it over.
Do you recall who that first responder was?
No.
Do you recall even whether it was a police officer, a firefighter, or a paramedic? Or...
No.
Now, as Mr. O'Keefe is being taken from where he was located when you found him to the ambulance, what happens then? What goes on from that?
At some point, Officer Good told Karen to calm down because she was frantic. And at some point, Jen and Karen were in the back of a police cruiser to warm up. I was standing outside watching the ambulance because I could see in through the ambulance that they were moving things and working on them.
And so what, if any, conversation did you have with the defendant or Ms. McCabe in reference to what you were seeing through the back of the ambulance?
I said, they're working on him, they're working on him. And at one point, Karen grabbed the front of my jacket and screamed in my face and said, are they working on him? Is he alive? And I said, they're working on him, they're working on him. They wouldn't be working on him if he was dead. And then she had us hold hands and pray. And then at some point, she had blood on her hands, and she told us she had her period. So I think she was just in a state of shock, maybe.
And what, if anything, did either you or Ms. McCabe say to her when she said that?
We said, no, that's not your blood. That's John's.
And what happened then?
Then the ambulance drove away.
And if you know about how long was it from the time that you were told by the paramedic to sort of step away from Mr. O'Keefe, they had this, from that point to when the ambulance drove away?
I don't know. I don't think it was long. I watched them work on whatever they were doing in the back of the ambulance, and they got in the ambulance and drove away.
And after the ambulance left, where did the three of you go, or where did you go? Where did Ms. Reed go? Where did Ms.
Karen, I had her in my car. Jen was going up to the door to her sister's house, and I said to the police, I had been on the phone now. I had called Mrs. O'Keefe. I had called John's mother. I had called John's father. At some point, Karen was on the phone with John's sister-in-law, Erin, telling him John's dead. So I grabbed the phone from her. I said, he's not dead. He's in the back of an ambulance. He's been in an accident. And she said that Paul was going to go, John's brother, to the hospital that they were bringing John to. So I spoke to I called Mr. O'Keefe. He didn't answer.
Next question. That'll stand. The next question.
You call Mr. O'Keefe and Mrs. O'Keefe John's parents.
Correct.
At some point, you have a conversation with them, correct?
Correct.
And do you know why it was that Ms. McCabe was going into the house on Fairview?
Objection.
Do you know why?
To wake her sister, I think.
And after those conversations, so you grab the phone from the defendant, you speak to Erin O'Keefe, correct?
Yes.
And following those conversations with members of the O'Keefe family, where is it that you were going from there?
I asked Mrs. O'Keefe if she had four-wheel drive, and she said no, and Mr. O'Keefe had a van that didn't have four-wheel drive. So I said, I'm going to come get you, and I'll take you to the hospital.
All right, so why don't we end this now for lunch? Okay. All right, Kerry's will take the luncheon.
Good afternoon.
So if I could take you back just for a moment, I apologize for this, but just for a moment back to when you first, where Mr. O'Keefe is on the grass, and at any point in time when you observed him, what, if any, observations did you make as far as how Mr. O'Keefe was dressed at that time?
Was he dressed?
Yes.
He had jeans on. I couldn't really tell because he was covered in snow. But I know that I think he had 2 layers on because when the defendant lifted his shirt.
Do you recall if any one of those layers was like a winter jacket or any kind of heavy coat or anything like that?
No.
I'm sorry, no, you don't recall, or no?
No, it was not a coat.
Now, let's take you back to when you were in front of the house and Mr. O'Keefe is in the back of the ambulance, and at some point in time that ambulance leaves, is that correct?
Correct.
And do you know where the ambulance was going?
Good Samaritan Hospital.
And following that, you mentioned that Ms. McCabe went inside the house, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall what it was that caused her to go inside the house?
Objection.
No, I'll allow that. Not what anyone said.
I think she was going to wake her sister.
And after that, was there anybody else that beyond sort of first responders or police officers, things like that, any other sort of civilian people show up that you recall?
Matt showed up at some point. Jen's husband, Matt.
And that was before you left, is that correct?
Yes.
And just to be clear, you had, and we'll get to this more in a moment, but you had left from the house once, come back, and then left again?
Yes.
And when her husband, Matt McCabe, showed up, which of those times was that, if you recall?
I think he was there when I left the first time.
And did you have any conversation with him?
I just said, he said, I said, I'm going to get the O'Keefes. He said, do you want me to come with you? And I said, no. So he went in the house.
And when you left, who, if anyone, initially when you left, who, if anyone, left with you?
I left with Karen Reed.
And as you're leaving in your car, you're driving, is that correct?
Yes.
Where is Miss Reed in the car at that point?
Say it again?
Where was Miss Reed in your car at that point?
In the passenger seat.
And as you were leaving, what, if anything, was it you were doing or talking about, or what was going on when you left that first?
As we were leaving, she was saying to me, if anything happens to John, I'm going to kill myself. You need to take care of these kids.
And how did you respond?
He's not going to die. No one's doing anything of that nature. Or something of that nature, I said.
And as far as you're driving away, Chapman, and you're facing towards Cedar Crest, is that right?
Yes.
And so when you left, are you following in that sort of same direction towards Cedar Crest?
I took a right onto Cedar Crest.
And then where did you go from there?
And then I got to Dedham Street, and I went to take a right. And then Officer Good let me go to pick up the O'Keefes to take them. I had to give him my phone number so that he could get in touch with me if he needed to. So he did call, and he said, do you have Miss Reed with you? And I said, yes. And he said, please bring her back. Her parents have called in a suicide. They said she's saying she's suicidal, so they want her to be sectioned.
And so coming back to that in a moment, but before you had left the scene, you hadn't talked to any police officers or anything at that time, correct?
No, other than my name and phone number, but no.
So you gave them your information and then said, I have to go pick up the O'Keefes.
Yes.
So you get that call from Officer Good, and then you come back to the house, is that right?
Yes.
And during any of that time, you recall the defendants? I know you had mentioned she spoke to Erin O'Keefe. Was there anybody else that the defendant spoke to or talked to while you were with her in the car?
She spoke to her mother. And then I ended up taking the phone and speaking to her mother, and I gave her my phone number, and I said, I'm going to go to the hospital. She said, please make sure she does not have her purse. She has medication in her purse I don't want her to take.
And then when you arrived back at the scene, what happened then?
She just got out of the car and walked to the ambulance.
And who, if anyone, did she walk, and by she, you mean the defendant?
I'm sorry, yes.
And who, if anyone, did the defendant walk from your car to the ambulance with?
She just walked, I think she just walked by herself. I had her phone because I had been talking to her mother. So then one of the first responders came over and said, do you have her phone? And I said, yes. Her mother said, make sure she does not have her purse.
And then following that conversation with one of the first responders, where did you go from there?
I went to go pick up the O'Keefes.
And as far as your drive from Canton, you went to, where do the O'Keefes live?
Braintree.
So your drive from Canton to Braintree and then subsequently from Braintree to Brockton, what, if anything, did you observe about sort of the driving conditions at that point?
I was actually on the phone with Katie Camerano, and I spun out, did a complete spun a couple times on 93, right near the Braintree exit, so that when I got to the O'Keefes, that we went back roads to Brockton because I didn't want to go on the highway.
And as far as the O'Keefes, as far as in your car from Braintree to Brockton, that was both John's mother and father?
Correct.
And at some point you get to the Good Samaritan Hospital in Brockton, correct?
Correct.
And do you know about what time it was that you got there?
I don't know.
When you arrived, where is it that you and the O'Keefes sort of go within the hospital?
John's brother Paul had already arrived, and then we all walked in. We were in the waiting area. John's cousin actually works on the switchboard. We had been talking to her on the way in because with COVID restrictions, we didn't know if we were going to be able to get in or. So she had come out from the switchboard, her office, because she knew there had been an accident. So she came out to greet her family. And then I asked her to take me to the bathroom to clean up and to the chapel.
And why was it that you had to go clean up?
Say it again?
Why was it that you had to go clean up?
Because I had blood on my hands.
Now, Ms. Roberts, you mentioned that during part of the drive from Canton to Braintree, you spoke to Ms. Camerano, correct?
Yes.
And during either that drive or the subsequent drive from Braintree to Brockton, who, if anyone else, did you speak to over the phone?
Karen called me repeatedly from the ambulance asking if I was going to come to the hospital. And she called when the O'Keefes were in the car and said she dropped him off at a party. And Mrs. O'Keefe said, you just left him? And Mr. O'Keefe said, leave her alone. She's been through enough. She called a few times while we were on the ride. And then she called a lot when we were at the hospital asking if I knew anything, if he was dead, is he dead? She would hang up and then call back, hang up and then call back.
And if you know about how many times was it?
At least 10.
And that same sort of phraseology that she was using on scene as far as if she's dead, she repeated that in the phone calls at the hospital?
Yes.
Now, once you arrive at the hospital and you're able to clean up a little bit, where did you go from there? What happened there?
I went to the chapel and I said a prayer, and then I went in and talked to John's cousin, and she said that Dr. Rice was going to ask to meet with the family and that they would be told how John was doing and that they would bring John's family back to see John. So when I came out, they were being called in by Dr. Rice, and I sat in the waiting area.
And after some period of time sitting in the waiting area, what happened then?
Mrs. O'Keefe came out and told me John was gone. And then she asked if I wanted to see him. So I did, because I figured it would be better than when I last saw him. Maybe he was cleaned up, but it was not. It was worse.
Sorry, ma'am, but as far as say that it was worse, back in into a room where John was, is that right?
Yes.
And what did you see?
He was in a neck brace, and both eyes were huge. Whereas when I found him, it was only one, but they were like black, almost like filled with, I don't know, blood or fluid. They were huge.
Beyond what you observed in his eyes, what, if anything else, did you see on John's body as you were?
He had scratches on his arm,
Do you recall which arm it was?
his right arm.
Do you recall where on his arm they were?
Like here.
Trying to assess whether it reflected the witnesses pointing to her forearm.
Yes.
Following that, as far as going in to see John, what happened then?
We came back out to the waiting area. Mrs. O'Keefe wanted to get his necklace off, but I couldn't get it. So her and Paul went back in to get the necklace off. And Karen had called me at some point from the hospital and said, my father's going to be coming. Can you just keep a lookout for him? So I said, so when Mr. Reed, her father, walked in, Mr. O'Keefe recognized him and he said, that's Karen's father. So I went over and I said, Mr. Reed, Mr. O'Keefe would like to speak to you. And then I just stood there. I didn't know what to do.
And at some point, did you leave from the hospital?
I did. I took Mr. O'Keefe in my car, and Paul took Mrs. O'Keefe in his.
And where did the two vehicles, where did you go?
I dropped Mr. O'Keefe off at John's house, and then I went home.
And without getting into too much detail as far as the road conditions that you described earlier, how were they?
It was absolutely horrible. I told Mr. O'Keefe, if you see a front door in your vision, we are about to hit a house, because I can't see where we're going. And my windshield wiper broke.
Now, so you dropped Mr. O'Keefe off at John's house on Meadows, is that right?
Yes,
And Ms. Reed's vehicle, was that still there at that point?
I think so. I don't recall, but I think so.
And then you went home, is that correct?
Yes.
Later on that day or that afternoon, if anyone came to your house to speak to you in regard to what?
There were two officers, but I don't remember their names.
And do you recall which department they were from?
The state police.
As far as the officers that came to your house and spoke to you, you don't recall their names, is that correct?
I don't.
Do you recall if either one of them was a Trooper Proctor?
It was not.
And where in your house did you speak to them?
In the dining room.
And did they speak to anybody else at your house at that time?
My husband.
And as far as when they spoke to you and they spoke to your husband, where were you when, starting with yourself, do you know where your husband was when the troopers were speaking to you?
I don't know where he was, but he wasn't in the room with me.
And same as far as when the troopers were speaking with your husband, where were you?
I was not in the room.
Following that, did you have occasion to speak to any other troopers or members of the state police at any point in time afterward?
I've only spoken to Michael Proctor one time. It was from Jen's house.
And when was that, if you know?
I don't know, maybe a couple days later, because Jen and I were re-going over what everything had happened. Mrs. O'Keefe had advised us to make a timeline because she said this could be a while. You guys aren't going to remember something years from now. So sit down, write down what you remember. And I, at that point, said, well, when she first called, she said he was dead. And Jen said, I don't think you've told them that. So Michael Proctor called, or she was on the phone with him, or I don't even know. And I said, could I speak to him? So I told him so that somebody had it documented.
So as far as Trooper Proctor was concerned, that phone conversation, is that the only contact that you have with Trooper Proctor?
Yes.
And if you recall, was it February 1st or so that you met with some troopers at Ms. McCabe's house?
State Trooper who?
At some point, did you meet with troopers at Ms. McCabe's house?
Yes.
And if you know, was that on or around a couple days later, like February 1st or so?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. I can't be sure.
Were either of those troopers that you met at Ms. McCabe's house, were either of those troopers Trooper Proctor?
No,
And do you recall where within Ms. McCabe's house you spoke to them?
in the living room.
And beyond yourself and the troopers that you spoke to, was there anybody else in the room with you when you spoke to them?
No,
At some point, either then or subsequent to then, was there any request made by any trooper from the state police in regard to your cell phone?
to my cell phone, yes.
And do you recall if it was that date or a later date?
It was not that day. I think it was the next day. It was within the next 2 days. They wanted to clone my phone.
And did they advise you of anything or give you any form that you had to fill out and execute prior to doing that?
Yes, I had to fill out a form.
And as far as your phone was concerned, were there any restrictions or anything that you gave to them as far as what they could look at or what they could clone or what they could do with your phone?
No,
And as far as how sort of that process works, as far as a cell phone extraction or anything, do you know anything about that?
no.
And do you recall how long it was that you were without your phone at the time you handed it over to them to whenever you got it back?
Well, they took both of our phones at the same time, and we didn't get them back for like 7 or 8 hours.
And just to be clear, when you say both of our phones, you're referring to who else's?
Jen's phone and my phone.
Now, at some point or at any point, did you give any kind of interview or have any conversation with any officer from the Canton Police in regard to what happened that day?
No,
And are you familiar with a Canton officer named Michael Lang?
yes.
How do you know him?
My daughter and his daughter are friends.
So beyond your daughters being friends, is that someone that you know or that you socialize with or anything like that?
No, I mean, they've come over to my house, his wife and him, one time, but we don't hang out with them socially. His wife and I are friends.
Now, at some point around this date, around January 29th, well, let me ask you, turning to the next day of January 30th, do you recall what you did that day?
We went over to the O'Keefe's house, my daughter, Jen, and Jen's daughter, and myself.
And following that, do you recall where you went?
My daughter wanted to get dropped off to her friend's house at Mike Link's.
And so after leaving the O'Keefe's house, is it still the same as far as yourself, your daughter, Ms. McCabe, and her daughter?
Her daughter stayed at the O'Keefe's.
And as far as Ms. McCabe was concerned, was it after dropping your daughter off, did you go anywhere with Ms. McCabe after that?
I just stopped at Mike Link's house, I think, and then we went home.
And so when you got to your daughter's friend's house, who, if anyone, did you speak with?
Mike's wife came out to the car to see how I was and how the O'Keefes were, and so she talked to us for a little, just asking how everyone was.
And if you know, ma'am, do you know about how long that conversation was?
I mean, I'm a talker, so it's probably a while. I'd say at least 45 minutes.
Was that a conversation like through the window, or did she get in the car? Or, you know?
I think she got in the car. She was in the back seat because it was freezing.
From that conversation, do you recall anything beyond sort of how people were doing or anything? Did you discuss anything about sort of what you had seen or what you had heard the day before on the 29th?
I don't recall. It was just a regular conversation. Well, not regular, obviously, but she was more concerned how the O'Keefes were doing, how the kids were doing.
And then after you left from the Lang's house, where did you go? Where did you and Miss McCabe go?
I don't know. I'm assuming home.
If I may have a moment, Tom?
Yes.
May we approach this briefly?
Okay.
I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor.
Okay, Ms. Little?
No questions, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. Oh, thank you.